welcome to this event. So this is under the auspices of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, of which I am president. And this is an adventure for all of us. So, this is who we are. We are Claire and Paula and Roger, and Alison, who doesn't appear on the slide, but she's essential to the running of this. She's going to keep us in order. So, with my presidential hat on, the Cambridge Philosophical Society, Natural Philosophy, is Cambridge's oldest scientific society. And so it's been around for a little over 200 years. And we have a wonderful book, which is really worth reading, which I will present to the other participants.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. With instructions to read it and inwardly digest it, of course. So, the Philosophical Society was founded in 1819, and the founding members were Adam Sedgwick, and John Stuart Henslow, and somebody called Clarke, who we don't really remember because he wasn't known for science. He was just a teacher, you know, but very enthusiastic. So the Darwin connection came really rather early, because Henslow was the person who suggested that Darwin would be the ideal naturalist for the Beagle voyage. And so that was how Darwin came to do that. I'm pleased to say also that one of Charles Darwin's sons became president of the Philosophical Society, so I'm a second-generation president. Now, the Philosophical Society, promulgating science and in the position that it was in, Henslow presented Charles Darwin's work to the Philosophical Society, and this was the first publication of the work that he was doing from the Beagle. And Charles Darwin didn't know about it, it just came from the letters that he'd been writing to Henslow. And so, for private distribution, there it was being presented. And so Henslow was promoting it. Unfortunately, Sedgwick wasn't quite so in favour of this evolution stuff and wrote these rather hard words about it. But there we are. That's not the Philosophical Society's fault. Now, where we are now, Newhall, now Murray Edwards College, this also has a Darwin connection. So the college started actually at the site which Darwin College is now on Silver Street, and was able to build on this site because the Darwin family gave one of the family houses, the orchard, to found the college, to help found the college. And so here's a picture of Ruth and Nora visiting their childhood home just before the orchard was demolished. And you can see part of the college buildings, which are now absolutely glorious and which we'll be in later on, some of us. So that's the connection that we have here. And I think that's all I need to say presidentially. I'll now change hat and let Alison take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. So I'm Alison Pearn. I'm the Associate Director of the Darwin Correspondence Project. And in 25 plus years of working on Charles Darwin, I think this is the most unusual thing I've been asked to do. But based on the conversations we've had, I think it's actually going to be one of the more fun. So I'm not going to attempt to introduce any of the members of the family. These are not panelists, these are members of the family. They're going to introduce themselves, and each of them is going to tell us a bit about the work that they do now. and then we'll see what happens. So I think it's Roger who's going first.
Okay.
So you've got the title slide.
Yeah. Yeah. So I press. Right, that's me. And swiftly move on. Yes, my father, rather younger than, he made it 93 or so. And what I love about this photograph is partly the expression on his face at Aunt Etty, but the fact that she's wearing her Victorian clothes and all that. And my father, as I say, only died not long ago. It immediately connects us all time-wise into that era. And I remember seeing him looking at this photograph and sort of chuckling quietly. He was very fond of it. And Etty, of course, helped Charles Darwin, CD, I'll call him, with The Descent of Man in the editing side. And she was a formidable lady. But in my great-aunt Gwen Raverat's book, Period Piece, which is all about growing up in Newnham Grange, now Darwin College, there's a chapter about Aunt Etty, a whole chapter. And this is a picture, a drawing by Gwen of Aunt Etty, who was a bit of a hypochondriac, she says. You can see that snout, or gas mask, as Gwen calls it, which was made out of a kitchen strainer stuffed with cotton wool. And she often scented it with eucalyptus as well, just so she could enjoy it. And would discuss politics with various people who used to come and see her. But in this case, she's ordering dinner in her patent anti-cold mask. So she had that aura for Gwen Raverat, and as she was to become, and my grandmother. And I should say that my connection with the family is through my grandmother, through Gwen Raverat's younger sister, Margaret Darwin, who also grew up in Newnham Grange, now Darwin College. And one of the reasons that we quickly, my brother Simon, who's in the audience with us, why we quickly loved things about the Darwin family was that I think from a very early age we learned that this book was written by a Darwin. I think you can see, yeah. I'm sorry, I just got to see that. Yeah, Bernard, you've got him there. Bernard and Eleanor. Bernard Darwin had an interesting reaction to being born into the family. He was a grandson of Charles, and he was the son of Francis Darwin, who was the botanical member of the family. And he I can't say he rebelled, but he reacted, quite certainly, drawing and producing this wonderful book with his wife, Eleanor, which we all read, or rather it was usually read to us, often by our grandmother initially. And here is what I think is his view in this book of what a Don would have looked like in those days. So Mr. Tootaloo was an adventurer. Call him nothing if you don't call him an adventurer. He was all over the place, around the world. And eventually he met his lady, and then eventually they were turned into birds briefly, and then they came back into humans. And Marmaduke, I haven't got a light here, but it doesn't really matter, maybe I have, that's Marmaduke there, tying a cracker to his tail. That's all we knew. And we loved this moment because soon after that, he flew up and he didn't like it. And so that was Bernard getting his own back on teachers, and I imagine anyway. But it all ended very happily. It's a wonderful 2-volume thing, both independent in their own right. And this is the lovely ending picture of Tootaloo and his wife and the children as well. So, you know, for small children, I strongly recommend that. You can probably get it from Amazon or various places secondhand. And I also want to introduce you, I'm thinking what turned me on slowly to realizing about the family. That was one thing, you just grew up with it. But also, my father gave me a book written by Charles Darwin's uncle, who was also called Charles. And Charles Darwin's uncle tragically died of meningitis at the age of 20 in Edinburgh Medical School when he was dissecting an infant who died with hydrocephalus, ballooning of the brain in the head. And he must have picked up the meningococcus bacterium at that point, and very quickly was dispatched. It was horrible. And his father, Erasmus, so Charles Darwin's grandfather, was extremely upset, as you can imagine he would be, because he seemed so unbelievably promising. He loved anything scientific. He collected flowers, plants. He wrote a wonderful letter, which my father passed on to me, to William Withering. There may be medics among you. You will certainly have heard of William Withering, who discovered digitalis, the foxglove, has this chemical within it, which is very good for treating cardiac failure. And with Erasmus, Withering, and Erasmus Darwin used to go around patients trying it out on them. It's quite clear that it was Withering who had the ideas and all that. But Erasmus also was so impressed by it that he also worked on it. And the book that I inherited from my father is this. Not the most promising sounding subject matter, experiments establishing a criterion between mucilaginous and purulent matter, right? Not the kind of thing you're going to... But you can see here where is a Carolo, Charles Darwin, and we're talking 1778. And he I think initially was, for a year at Christchurch in Oxford. He really didn't like that. I don't know why, but he didn't. And he went to Edinburgh, which was full of wonderful, enlightened people in those days. Still is, probably. And, he loved the medical school, and he was on target to be, I'm sure, an extremely brilliant doctor of some kind. So if anyone's interested in this, St Cuthbert's Church, or whatever it is, in Edinburgh is where there's a memorial for him, which Erasmus, his father, had built. The book, notice, cost 2 and 6. Right, so that's him. So all those things have slowly built up in my own experience of being peripheral, but still part of the Darwin family. And I went into medicine from school. I did, biology A-levels, and thought I was going to become a neurologist. And sort of became a neurologist, but I actually did about 5 years of junior doctoring and then discovered that actually neurology wasn't for me. And the reason for that was because whereas in intensive care and cardiology and things, you could really do things and make a difference, neurology is not like that. It's better now, much better now, but in those days it wasn't that great. And I had this hunch that the thing to get interested in, it was only a hunch, was growth, nerve growth, and what regulates that. And if you think about nerve growth, because of course what the brain is famous for not doing is growing once it's damaged. Something must be regulating growth. So I realized that very little was known about that, and it seemed like a good area to get into. I went to a lab in Oxford. Michael Brown, the scientist working there, was looking at the way nerves grow in muscle fibers and on muscle fibers and what stimulates that. And that got me interested in, well, alongside that, one day somebody in the lab produced a chick embryo. He just cracked open the egg and the embryo dropped into a Petri dish. And I looked at it, and within, 5 minutes, I had this feeling, I said, I'm going to work on that. They were so, Peter Medawar, a great immunologist, called that one of the most marvelous sights in biology, a 3-day chick embryo, complete and whole in the egg. And it is extraordinary. And I'm sure Aristotle and those people, when they saw the heart in that, got very excited about it. And that got me interested because I thought, well, let's get into spinal nerves. I came back to Cambridge and had a lab, and I was entirely on my own, wondering what to do in the Department of Anatomy, which when I was a student I hadn't given very much time to, I have to say. But there we are. I then became an anatomist and got interested in how the growth and patterning of the nervous system is constructed. And so this is a well-known anatomical preparation by John Evelyn, a diarist, which is so-called Evelyn tables, one of these at the Royal College of Surgeons. See the ladder-like arrangement of the spinal nerves coming out under the ribs. That's a simple-looking pattern, and I stumbled on, in a chick embryo, how that develops just anatomically. And although it ends up that the nerves come out between the vertebrae, as you see all the way down the long axis, and so when you slip a disc, they go out and then impinge hard and fast onto the outgrowing spinal nerves, and it hurts like hell. So obviously when they develop, they have to avoid each other. It's clearly important that that happens. And that got myself together with my colleague, who's a biochemist, Geoffrey Cook, who couldn't be here today, but I owe a lot to Jeff over the years. We've been working together since the mid-80s on this subject. He and I realized that it could be a combination of repulsion by a part of the outgrowth pathway of the very early nerves here, and or something attractive in the part that they do eventually go through. In fact, these little blobs of cells are called somites, and they make the vertebrae, but it's quite a clever story. I won't go into it. That got us to thinking there might be something repulsive, something that was blocking nerve growth, as well as something attractive. And we thought, well, let's just see what happens to the cells that are involved here. That is one of the cells from the early developing vertebra, and here is a nerve cell growing out in the dish, and that's the growing nerve ending. They grow out like hands. They just grow along and find their way all the way through your system, and yet, of course, they end up making the most complicated biological structure in the, well, who knows about universe? There may be others that are even more complicated. It's complicated enough. So that's a growth cone. That was christened, and then christened by a Spanish scientist. And you see when the fingers of the growth cone finally get to touch the surface of this cell, that they are already within 6 minutes of that touch taking place. They're already withdrawing back, even sprouting a little branch there. And so by 12 minutes, they're veering away. They don't like it. There's something there that says, piss off. And we called it piss offin for many years, but of course couldn't publish that as its name, much as we would like to have done. In fact, it's turned out to be an interesting combination of nitric oxide being handled by a clever enzyme. I won't go into it, but it's a very interesting enzyme on the surface of these cells in the developing vertebrae. And so when nitric oxide gets into that system, they withdraw and they pull back. And the reason for going into all this detail, sorry, Paula, I'll go back from that. Well, you can sit there for now. The reason I've gone into all that detail is because the repulsive side of it is, I think, particularly interesting. And it turns out that the grey matter in the brain, this is something we discovered in the 90s, is loaded with the same stuff. Now, that's not published. We haven't, that fact that it's in grey matter is published, but we've done other things since that tell us that it might well be interesting in these horrible diseases that we all know about, that a lot of people very sadly die of eventually, you know, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, all those things, neurodegenerative. There may be something in common to them. Of course, I would love it if it was something to do with this, but it may well not be. I'm well aware of that. But so far, quite honestly, nobody knows what really goes on in those conditions. There are a lot of chemicals made in the nerve cells later, which tangle and all sorts of things, but whether they cause it is a big question. So I think there's enough interesting going on in this field for us, Jeff and myself, to pursue this. We published it just after I retired. Jeff is already retired. I retired 3-4 years ago. We now have a converted carpentry shed in the grounds of the house that I now live in, which I'm very happy to be in. It was where my grandmother Margaret moved to after my grandfather, and she moved out of London to Cambridge in the early 50s. So we've converted his shed into a lab where we can just do what the hell we like, even brew up the chickens if we have to. We'll see. So anyway, we want to carry on as far as we can. Now, Paula, your turn. So I will,
So I'm Paula. I approach this slightly differently. I'm a generation removed, so this is a sort of a little family tree that lives in my parents' house. As you can see, I am from the line of George and Maud. And then my grandfather was Erasmus, and my father is Robert, and my brother is George. So my growing up happened in colour photographs, so very recently. And here you can see on the left a picture of me with my sort of immediate extended family. And a lot of these people had a very big influence on me growing up. So my grandparents at the bottom, they had a lovely house in Essex, which was very well positioned for fossil hunting on beaches, which was a very popular pastime, equipped with sandwiches. That's sort of me on the top, fossil hunting. And I also had a lovely aunt and a lovely uncle who regularly took me to the Natural History Museum, and my parents also regularly took me to the Natural History Museum. I was very well acquainted with the Natural History Museum. And my aunt actually worked there, and that's where she met her husband. So that was a key part of childhood. Sort of as a teenager, I was very interested in debate. So I was part of a debate club, which is very cool. And I would get an article, and then I would have a weekend to mull over it, and then I'd sort of have to be ready to discuss it the next week. And every Sunday, my parents and my brother and I would sit at our Sunday lunch, and we would discuss the article, a lot of which was sort of ethics and sort of science and sort of why do we do things the way we do them. So that was sort of a big part of the culture of growing up a Darwin. That was sort of, you would spend a day sort of, you'd be like, okay, I found this interesting bug in a textbook. Might we have it in this garden? Should we go look for it? Or just sort of go out on walks with a lot of nature guides. So I, unsurprisingly, got very interested in biology. There was a lot of biology around me. So I did an undergrad in biological sciences, where I got to do some really, really cool work. So the bottom row is work I did in Iceland, where that was a sort of, we were looking at extremophile bacteria, and we looked at bacteria that were found in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, because that sort of mysteriously cleared up quite quickly. So we were looking at bacteria that were found after the clear up of the oil spill and whether they could potentially degrade bioplastics. Then the top two left pictures, I worked in the lab in France, where we were looking at sort of adaptations of bacteria to traveling long distances using weather systems. So it's a bacteria called Pseudomonas syringae, and it has reservoirs in the Arctic. So we got our bacteria from Iceland, and the theory is that it sort of travels through clouds. It then causes something called ice nucleation, so the rain falls, and it will infect plants in the south of France. So we were looking at whether we could directly tie these bacteria in these reservoirs to infection, sort of ability to infect plants in the south of France, sort of linking those two together. I then, following on from this sort of very clear trajectory of bacteria, decided to do my undergrad thesis in cancer biology and looking at how diet might affect outcome in patients of chemotherapy and radiotherapy. The answer is it doesn't, from what I can tell. So negative results are still results. But that sort of led me into my work, which I'm doing now. So I'm looking at diet-induced obesity. I'm looking at lipid remodeling and metabolic dysfunction in diet-induced obesity. I am working with on the far left, that's my supervisor here in Cambridge in the Department of Physiology, Development and Neuroscience. That's Andrew Murray, who also gave the A.V. Hill Lecture in 2020, if you're an avid watcher of Phil Sock stuff. Then that's my other supervisor, Jules. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. Yeah. Thank you.
When I was smaller, my brother and I used to spend a lot of time with my grandmother at the grand house that you can see there, Boswell's in the Chiltern Hills. So my grandmother was Nora, who we have met before, grew up on this site. She was a formidable lady. She had no formal education, actually. She didn't go to university. She only went to things that were really finishing schools. So what she picked up was really through the family, through what was going on around her. But she was writing papers on genetics and having produced all those children and got out the other end, she then wrote quite a lot of books and became a really serious Darwin scholar as well as a botanist. So in the bottom, you've got a picture of Nora and Sir Edward Salisbury, who was director of the Botanic Gardens at Kew, so a leading botanist in his day, and me. And so I had found an interesting flower out in, this is calcareous Chiltern Hills, and wanted to know what it was. And they came out, had a look, it was interesting, and there they are, aged about 10, taking me absolutely seriously, and we're having a very interesting discussion. That was what life was like at Boswell's. So my grandfather was a bureaucrat, civil servant, but he did move in high circles. He was personal private secretary to Ramsay MacDonald, who was Prime Minister, but that didn't agree with him. And he went on to be part of the Board of Trade, was very keen on promoting science education, which is something which is very close to my heart. So at the lunch table at Boswell's, there were discussions, and you never knew who would be there, but it could well be the world expert on something. I'm going to tell an anecdote. So one of these lunches, the conversation came round to how cats managed to lap up what they did. How did they manage to lap up liquids? What did they do with their tongues? And so somebody was sent off to get the cat, it was put on the table, saucer of milk, and we observed what it did. That was scientific discovery. That was this curiosity, and just no question was a silly question. So Nora Barlow, she was a botanist. There's an Aquilegia here, Nora Barlow, named after her. She hated that one, all pink and frilly. The director of the university library, Fred Ratcliffe, wanted a portrait of Nora. He was quite a frequent visitor to her house when she moved to Cambridge, back to Cambridge. And my mother would visit once a month, and she was an artist, a professional artist, and she did a drawing of Nora, and Fred said, I want that in the university library. So she painted to them another one, and here she is presenting it to Fred in Cambridge, and it hangs in the university library now. It's probably the only picture of a cat in the university library. So, for myself, I didn't turn into a botanist. I was more interested in the physical sciences, but microscopy was a fascination to me. I had a year out at the National Physical Laboratory at Teddington, which the director before my time was another Charles Darwin. And so there's a link there. I did a lot of microscopy. I was interested scanning microscopy, and so up at the top left we've got a photograph of the first stereo scan produced by the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company, so scanning electron microscope, and got some images here on different materials from scanning electron microscopes. And so my career has been guided by curiosity and not by any structured motive to promote my career. So it's been a bit random, I have to say. And one of the bits of randomness was, became a fellow of Newnham, so sitting in college lunch, Mary Archer came to sit next to me. And she would sit next to me when she wanted to talk about something, wanted something of me. And she said, well, I've got this violin maker who wants to know a bit more about what he's doing when he does these different treatments. Can you suggest somebody who might be able to help with that? So I said, me. And that took me into some very interesting work with old violins, including analysing Stradivari violins, which brought me into contact with violin makers who are a race apart. And one of the challenges there is communicating appropriately with them, which is something that I find fascinating. So I love teaching, I love getting messages across in appropriate ways to people. And so talking with violin makers has been part of the joy there. There's a metal picture up there, which it looks like a landscape, but it isn't. It's to do with dislocations and surface structures. So I work on much less glamorous things mostly at the moment. So the environmental aspects of materials, I work on what you put in your blue bin. On my holidays, I go and gather up rubbish on the beach. And when I tell people that I work on rubbish, I really can't get in the word edgeways because they say it's disgraceful what we have to put in our blue bin. What's all that about? Why doesn't somebody do something about it? Well, actually, it is really difficult. So the wrapper of David Stowe cheese is not just a plastic bag. It's got a structure, which you can see at the bottom there, with a lot of different functions which it has to fulfill simultaneously. It's a complicated structure. It's very difficult to recycle, but it does its job amazingly well. If we substitute other materials for it, the carbon footprint of those is much bigger. The global warming resulting from that and from the less good preservation of the food is huge and absolutely outweighs all the benefits of recycling. So it's a complicated problem. And so that's why people, although they are doing something about it, they haven't produced the answer yet. And anybody who thinks that this is a simple problem and tells you the simple answer, they're just deluded. There are other things which are easier to recycle, so aluminium scrap, but this was a neat idea which we had for recycling aluminium at a fraction of the energy cost, but to a less good material, so that one doesn't actually fly. But we could make a machine like that at the top where you just turn the handle and recycle the aluminium yourself. We could do that. That's all I'm going to say. Alison, it's over to you, really.
Well, I think, but thank you. Thank you all three so much. There's an enormous amount that we could pick up on there. The danger for me is that I'm constantly going to say, oh, Darwin would have done this. For one thing, lots of other Darwins available, not just the Charles that I've worked on, as all those introductions have shown. I do think your family needs to recycle a few more names. And I do want to pick up on things like curiosity and these experiences of childhood very much. But there's one fairly obvious difference here, which is, Paula, you are the one who actually carries the Darwin name. So, and speaking as someone who's, has just worked on Darwin all these years, I know he's really difficult to get away from. The name is really difficult to get away from, crops up all over the place. So what has that been like for you, really, has that been a help, a hindrance? Have you had to think very actively about what you were and were not going to pursue in your life?
I think it's a conversation starter. I think in a lot of the cases it's very helpful because it's interesting, but sort of in the way that other things about a person are interesting. I think it can be a hindrance because I think people sort of say, oh, she's a scientist, she's a Darwin. Sort of how difficult was that journey? But yeah, I think it's a surname that lends itself very easily to looking into your own family history, which is something I've only recently really started to do.
Is that something that you think you will do more and more? I'm quite interested in the stage at which any of you might have thought that you perhaps were being drawn into something about your own family history. Just to prove my own point about my own professional weakness, and Charles Darwin actually started to look at his own family history when he was in his late 60s, which is actually something that people really quite typically do, and it's quite endearing in a way to see that happening with him. I mean, you are a younger generation, but you've begun to be interested in what aspects do you think of?
I think being here plays a big role in it. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Reading. There's no college named Darwin College in Reading. Very little. So it wasn't really something that was sort of a thing that I would have pursued there. Where sort of here, having the university library here is what a massive resource. So I went in a few weeks ago in sort of preparation for this, and I got out one of Erasmus's books, The Temple of Nature, which was quite a controversial book in its time, and it was interesting to sort of to read it. And nowadays you would never think that anything said there is in any way controversial, but it's sort of there's two separate prefaces in the book saying this is a work of fiction. Do not read this as science, but it's very clearly science.
There's lots more that you can read if you want to come back. I mean, for Roger, both Roger and Claire, I mean, perhaps slightly in contrast to that, you both have near family relatives who actually really engaged in Darwin industry. Claire, Nora is perhaps, she's sometimes called the person who began the Darwin industry. Thank you very much, Nora. Yeah.
Yes.
Was that something you were very aware of?
Well, there was always talk of CD at the lunch table, so he was very much around. But he wasn't pushed down our throats, but there was obviously interest there. And so I don't think that I was much influenced by CD, but more by her as an enormously strong character. And I think propagating Darwin values to her children and grandchildren.
Did she express it in that way? I mean, were the values something? No, she didn't.
Not at all. No, it was just the way that she behaved.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't do silly things. You didn't idle away your time. And you.
But getting the cat up on the dinner table is not silly, because that's the. And I think that's very resonant. I think perhaps that experience, I don't know whether that experience of being surrounded by very inquiring scientific relatives who clearly had that that approach to investigation, that there are no foolish questions. I mean, there's definitely something you come across. I mean, would you say that you had shared that experience? Would you?
Yes, I think so. And I remember a rather wonderful moment. My brother Simon may remember this too, when we discovered that, I mean, this is not this kind of thing any child really should be doing, but on Guy Fawkes Day, you could coat a banger in mud and then drop it into the pond, which we had and it would go sort of boom-oomph, and this stuff would float up, and then poor goldfish would surface. And we were just at that age of boyhood when, you know, we didn't really think about what we did. But our father was also around, and he said, just go and do that somewhere else. So we thought, okay, we'll go upstairs in the house, take one of the sinks, and try it out there, which we did. And the base of the sink blew down, mud all over the ceiling. We survived, everyone survived, but that was an experiment that my father suggested to us, and I think perhaps deep down we weren't convinced that that was a very good idea.
And so, did he, after the experiment was complete, did he see that as a scientific pursuit?
He was very angry. He was quite capable of getting angry, is my father. And actually that's an interesting, because it reminds me of another thing I wanted to say, which my mother inherited this. Whenever she would hear, this was when she was in her 60s, 70s, would hear, it was when my father was being a Darwin scholar and editing and annotating the Beagle diary and the zoological notes and all those things which he published. Around that time, my mother wouldn't see very much of him in the house. And he was always off doing his Darwin stuff. And our daughter, who was picked up from school, which was just down the road, by my mother, suddenly started producing this funny word, which sounded as if it was written T-A-R-M-E-N-T, tarments. She would suddenly say tarments at the age of sort of 4 or 5, tarments. And for years we wondered what that was, and we realized that what it must be was Darwin's, in her mind, picked up the word, but used it in a way that my mother would have used it, which was a moment of sort of, Darwin stuff. It was all about Darwin. So it turned into not exactly a swear word, but, you know, something engaging with that side of one's brain. And, you know, it comes out in funny ways, in other words. My daughter would be appalled to hear me relaying the story now. Maybe you can tell her. But anyway, we were amused by that.
Did you have the same experience of being encouraged to be curious?
I think I don't have quite as great an anecdote as the explosion in the sink, I have to say. I think in a slightly more sort of botanical way, sort of, I'm just thinking. So my grandmother, so Raz's wife, Shuna, she was very keen on us sort of engaging with the wildlife in and around the marshes in Essex. So a friend would come over who was pretty good at moths, and he would set out a trap, and then sort of dusk would fall, and sort of just at the end of dusk, me, my brother, my grandmother, and this man, Mr. Fisher, would open this box and sort of identify the moths and sort of release them, and sort of that was something we did a lot, and it was very cool. My favorite moth still to this day is the elephant hawk moth, which is an enormous pink moth. Yeah, it really tickled me as a 6-year-old.
So you've all had careers actually that have been very broad, and you clearly have interests that go outside what you would think of as normal disciplines. I wonder if that is again a product of being surrounded by this very scientific way of thinking, and it's very reminiscent, I think, of Charles Darwin's own upbringing, but also of the upbringing of his children. So Henrietta, of the wonderful prescient mask, I mean, she really was a woman ahead of her time with that face mask, was clearly someone like Nora, who had no formal education, but had absorbed so much of what was around her, and they were very engaged in the wider discussions. I mean, would you say that it is that childhood, it's that background that has been a formative part of your careers and your lives in science?
Yes, certainly, yes. So I was always asking, why? And sometimes there were answers, but the answers might be, I don't know, but let's go and find out. My father was he was a medic. He actually started off as an engineer briefly here, I found his card in the engineering department before he moved into medicine. But he was, in fact, a very good engineer and had these very broad interests. And so there were always making and mending and asking and looking things up.
That must actually give you quite a lot of confidence to do that kind of asking of foolish questions that get, often get good results, which is a bit of a Darwin quote. Just to think a little bit more seriously for a minute, I mean, is that something that we can in any way try to replicate in education for people? Because I think all children ask why, but I think most children get the answer because I said so, which is and so that actually somehow managing, maybe there is no answer for this, but it's really striking, I think, in talking to all of you, that you've had that shared experience of this very supportive, the support of your own curiosity, I suppose, which is a word Darwin used all the time. It's a word with a bit of a complicated history. In Victorian times, curiosity wasn't always thought of as good, and it's not always thought of as good now, is it? So, I mean, I don't know whether there's any thoughts there about how we can make this more available.
Yes, and I thought about that because you wrote that down just the other day, and it's very, very difficult to know. But I'm sure in any family, if mummy or daddy is in any way curious about something, it's going to, excite the imagination of the children. I can't believe it would be anything other than a positive thing. It must happen a lot, and of course it does. It does happen a lot. I don't know how, though, you could sort of program it into families. I really don't. What was rather wonderful about Charles Darwin, in some respects, for someone like myself, thinking, can I possibly do what he did? He set the bar so high, that it gives you something to judge all sorts of other people against. But it's such a long way off, that it helps in some ways, thinking of it that way. But curiosity, clearly, right? I mean, the Charles Darwin I mentioned, that was the thing that they talk about, him having had that overwhelming interest in all that. And that must have been Erasmus, I imagine.
You also mentioned rebellion, Roger, as something that, and clearly you've all had wonderful careers and you are in science, but were you ever tempted to be an economist? Did you move deliberately away?
No. I'm very glad I'm not an economist, especially having seen what's just happened with economics. I mean, I'm not sure they know a huge amount. And of course, my great-uncle would have been the first to say that. I've often said, and this is unfair really, that often you feel economics is a branch of psychiatry. It's not fair. But, it is based on human, whatever. I don't know whether in the expression of the emotions, whether CD, I can't say I've read it cover to cover, whether he touches on the drive to sort of, gather stuff for yourself or for everyone around it. Money making, that kind of thing. I don't know if he does, but it's an interesting one.
Don't think so, but we can discuss that with other colleagues. Yeah. Discusses more the opposite, really, kind of altruism, certainly in Descent of Man. But I mean, you all have, the other thing is, of course, that you are part of a clan. I mean, this is not simply a family. You have this really wide set of relationships where you're actually much more likely, in a way, to know your second cousins, third cousins twice removed, and all the rest of it. I was very, very pleased to discover that we actually, I believe, introduced the three of you when we launched the Darwin in Conversation exhibition. Just to plug, if no one has been yet, please do, in the university library. And I was actually rather surprised by that, because I've come across so many members of the Darwin family in the course of the work, and many people very engaged and in very different fields. Do you have that sense of being part of a wide clan? I mean, when you meet, do you feel a shared heritage?
Yes, I think so. In 2009, so big Darwin celebratory stuff, we had 2 Darwin parties, having never, I don't think, ever had one before. I organised one at Darwin College, so Darwins at Darwin. And at that time, there were 249 living descendants of Darwin, and not all of them came to the party, but it was quite a lot. And I'd never met most of them before. The people over on the left-hand side, I know my first cousins very well, some more distant cousins, but more of the Darwin side I'd never come across, and it was very interesting to meet people on that occasion.
Yeah, no, we have. We've had one in Down House, I remember, we were talking about it earlier, where I have a photograph of my daughter, now a medical student, you know, that size, which was rather nice, the youngest member of the family. So, and another one that we've also had in in London. And that really does give you a sense of a bigger clan, and I like it. The older I get, I wouldn't really have taken much notice of it earlier. I'm sure it's something that age does too. Is it enhances your clan feelings? Yeah, you know, it's undoubtedly a factor. So just because of CD having set the bar so high and all that, we still meet. And I know my father loved that side of it. I can see him now on his 80th birthday party in Cambridge, saying, having worked on all these notes and things for more than a decade, he said, well, after all this, he said, I can only say one thing about CD. He said, he just must have been the nicest man who ever lived. I remember, you know, he adored him, absolutely adored him. And I'm sure he was adorable. And with you can be great. Isaac Newton, I sometimes wonder about, in an equivalent position, bar exactly the same height or near enough. CD has so many admirable, I'm not, you know, one can't compare them, but there was a difference, I think, in the way they came across as people.
Well, I think Martin Rees would agree with you, because I've certainly heard him say very nice things about Charles Darwin and not so complimentary ones about Isaac Newton, but that's...
Yes.
Is that important? I mean, I wonder, because I think as an historian, I'm meant to stay objective, but I have to say, I do like him. You know, I think this is nice, and I suspect this is a common experience, people working on him. And is that, have you engaged with him as a person in that? Do you feel a personal connection? I suppose it's something I should ask. Paula, you're a generation more removed, but...
Yeah, I think, so when I was 17 in school, we were given a reading list for the summer of sort of, if you want to do biology at university, these are some books you might want to read. So Bad Science by Ben Goldacre is on there, and sort of it was alphabetical. So first on the list was On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And I came to the realization that I would be made a mockery of if I finished that summer having not even read my own ancestors' work that was on the reading list. So we got the audiobook of On the Origin of Species, which came with the Voyage of the Beagle. And I think we were doing a road trip through France. And all we listened to was just endless stories of Charles Darwin on the Beagle, and then sort of a bit of On the Origin. And it's really interesting how I sort of started this sort of metaphorical and literal journey, not knowing this man who a lot of people spoke about, but then both of these books together give you such a good idea of what he must have been like, how he thought, and his scientific process. It's sort of, I thought, On the Origin, it must start with finches. It starts with pigeons. It's great. It's a really good book. I can recommend it.
Well, that's good to know.
And he wrote so well.
Yeah.
It's so clear. It's just a joy to read, isn't it?
Yeah. It's such a well-written book, and it's sort of, sometimes as a scientist, you're reading research papers and you're like, this is really interesting, but it's a struggle. to get through it, and you quite easily get through on The Origin. It's really remarkable.
Well, yes, and I think it was a book that was really meant to reach a really wide audience, and it has done. You know, it's fulfilled that. That's really interesting. So you didn't steer away from it; you actually steered towards it.
Yeah, I first question back in biology class, sort of 17, was, "Did you read it?" Almost. I listened to it.
I'll have to ask you more about that later. Who actually reads it? Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about. So you have all engaged with his work and read it. Excuse me. What do you think of him as a scientist?
I think he's very careful in his science, the way in which a lot of modern scientists are. He sort of wrote most of this book, sat on it for 9 years, because he didn't want to publish anything that he didn't fully back. And you see that in his writing. You see that he sort of thinks, okay, I did this, and this is what happened, so I decided to do many more experiments so that this wasn't just a fluke. And it's a concept that's very modern, I would say, having read a lot of other research papers from around the time, where it feels a lot more sort of, I saw this, and so this must be true, and that's the matter of it.
Good method, yeah. And is that something you see shared with other members of the family?
Do you think that sort of rigour? Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
You're going to have to talk amongst yourselves for the moment.
But industry, I mean, just hard work. No question about that. But that's also wired in, yeah.
Well, because we had talked a lot about curiosity when we were sort of preparing for this. I did. It reminded me very much of the letter that he wrote when he's asked to recommend, to give advice to aspiring biologists, and says that really you need to follow your curiosity. And it seems as if that's something that you have all certainly done and been encouraged to do, which is an absolutely wonderful thing. I'm conscious of the time, which I think is my real job. But it's such fun, and I think there could be so much, many more conversations. Are there other things that you'd really like to raise, to points to make?
I wanted to mention, because I said to my brother earlier, talking about the industry which carries on down the generations, that my brother has produced he commissioned the building of a beagle about that size. And whether I just want to make it publicly known and hope that one day that will be displayed somewhere in Cambridge. I don't know where, but it's a wonderful sort of example of how he's inspired great-great-grandsons in this case. So I'd like to see that.
I second that, because it's beautiful. Claire, I don't know whether there's anything that...
I think my finishing comment would be just about the importance of education, that we've been fantastically fortunate in our families, but for most people that isn't on offer. So it's what they get in school that's so important. So if we can teach the teachers to excite curiosity and to give answers which aren't just this is how it is, but let's find out, that would be really such a benefit.
Yeah. Paula, do you have any... You've told us a lot, actually, about and it's great that you're going into the university library. I think that if you go and look at Zoonomia, you'll see Charles Darwin reading his grandfather, who he'd slightly avoided, I think, really, at an earlier stage, and had been slightly nervous and was actually accused of plagiarising him at one stage. But so you can follow on in the tradition. You can go and see the notes that he's written in Zoonomia I think I want to thank all of you so much for introducing us to your experiences of being part of this amazing intellectual clan. We haven't even touched on Huxley's, Wedgwood's, Cornford's, and all the many other names that your family tree reaches. A bit like your nerves. I think the family trees are reaching out. Whether they avoid anything, I'm not quite sure. It's been absolutely fantastic. It's been lovely to listen to you all. I hope everybody in the audience has enjoyed it as much as I have, and will just join me in saying thank you for a very interesting conversation. Thank you. You're very welcome.